It was the kind of February night that gnawed at your bones, thick with silence, cold enough to freeze spit mid-air. Out on the edge of rural Ashford County, Kentucky, a widowed black farmer named Samuel Ellis clutched his old rifle and stepped into the barn behind his house. His dog, Rufus, had been barking at something for 10 straight minutes, and Samuel wasn't in the mood for raccoons. He was certainly not expecting a woman, but there she was, a white woman, curled up in the hay like she belonged there, as if the bitter wind hadn't clawed through every crack in the world. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Just slowly opened her eyes, like someone halfway between sleep and surrender. "You know this is my land, right?" Samuel asked, lowering his flashlight but not his voice. "I wasn't trying to steal anything," she croaked. "Just needed a place out of the wind." Samuel looked closer. Her coat was too thin, her gloves torn, her boots barely holding together. There was something familiar about that kind of desperation, something that didn't flinch even when facing a man with a gun. She didn't look crazy, just used up. "What's your name?" he asked cautiously. "Claire Mathers," she answered. "I came by train. Been walking for 2 days. I was looking for someone, a man named Samuel Ellis." That stopped him cold, because that was his name, and he hadn't told it to anybody in weeks. Claire said she had a letter that said he was looking for someone kind, someone to help him raise a child and keep his land going. Samuel's chest tightened. He had written a letter like that, a year ago, in a moment of despair after the second winter without his wife Miriam, after another rejected loan, another church whisper, another day of barely feeding his 4-year-old daughter, Rosie. He had poured his fear and hope into words, then folded that letter and stuck it in a drawer. Never mailed it, never told a soul. Now here was this woman claiming to have received it. He should have asked questions, should have thrown her off his property. In a town like Ashford, a black man letting a white woman sleep under his roof was enough to spark rumors that could get him killed. But Samuel wasn't driven by fear anymore. He was driven by something deeper, something only people who've been crushed learn to listen to: instinct. "You can't sleep in the barn," he said finally. "Come inside. There's a fire and some soup." Claire followed silently, her boots crunching on the snow, while Rufus trailed behind them like they were already family. The house was sparse, worn, and quiet. A faded photo of Miriam hung above the hearth. Her light skin, soft eyes, and calm smile were all that remained of the woman the town barely tolerated. She'd been a nurse in the war, met Samuel while he was working tanks for the army. They married in Chicago, where people mostly minded their business. But when they moved to Ashford, they found something else. Southern hospitality that smiled to your face and undercut you behind your back. With Miriam gone, the masks had dropped completely. Claire ate slowly, thanking him between bites. Samuel watched her hands. How she held the spoon, like it was the last thing keeping her tethered to this world. There was pride in her still, despite the cracks. That kind of pride didn't come from nowhere. "What makes a white woman travel across the country to find a black man she's never met?" he finally asked. "Because I had nothing left," she said plainly. "I told the man I worked for no, and suddenly I had no job, no room, no safety. I ran. Your letter was the first thing that made me feel like I still had a choice." That struck Samuel in a way he hadn't expected. Displaced people knew each other, even if they came from different wars. Pain recognized pain. "Can I stay?" Claire asked, her voice softer now. "Just until the storm passes." Samuel nodded slowly. "Stay as long as you need." And that should have been the end of it. Just a good man offering shelter to someone who'd lost her way. But that's never how stories like this go. Because in that small act of mercy, a domino tipped that would eventually rattle the entire county. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire with the letter in his hands, staring at the words he once wrote when he thought he'd be swallowed whole by the world. The bank had given him until the end of the week to come up with money he didn't have. The judge, Harlan Mays, was circling like a hawk, interested in buying the land at a fraction of its worth. The same land Samuel's father had broken his back for, the same soil Miriam had planted a garden in when Rosie was born. And now, sitting in his guest room, was a stranger who might just be the unexpected answer to a question Samuel hadn't known how to ask out loud. The next morning came with frost on the window panes and tension in the air. Claire was already awake, cooking breakfast. Rosie peeked at her shyly from behind a doorway. The child had Miriam's skin and Samuel's curls, and a quiet that came from being watched too closely in a town that never approved of her existence. "She's beautiful," Claire said gently as Samuel joined them at the table. "She's her mother's daughter," Samuel replied, unable to hide the ache in his voice. They ate in silence, and Samuel said what he'd been turning over all night. "I have to go into town, the bank." Claire looked at him carefully. "It's not safe for you to leave me alone here, is it?" Samuel didn't answer. He didn't need to. "I'll come with you," she offered. "As your housekeeper." He looked up, surprised. She was sharp. That wasn't just survival instinct, that was strategy. An hour later, the three of them rode the buckboard into Ashford. Claire wore one of Miriam's old hats, half her face tucked under its brim. Rosie sat between them, dozing. They looked, to any outsider, like a quiet family. Ordinary, invisible, exactly how Samuel needed it to look. The man waiting at the bank was Thomas Kane, the branch manager. He smiled like a man who'd already moved the chess pieces in his mind. "Mr. Ellis," he said, "we weren't sure we'd see you. The deadline's tomorrow, you know." "I know," Samuel said calmly. Kane glanced at Claire, who kept her gaze on Rosie and her hands folded neatly. "And who's this?" "This is Miss Mathers," Samuel answered evenly. "She helps me with Rosie." Kane raised an eyebrow. Unusual arrangement. "A fair wage brings good help, regardless of skin color," Samuel replied, then added, "Now about that extension?" Kane led him into a back office and shut the door. What came next wasn't a negotiation. Kane laid it out cold. No extension, no second chances. The judge had already made an offer on Samuel's land, and Kane wanted the signature before the sun went down. The money? Laughable. Barely enough to buy back a quarter of what the land was worth. "I'll bring my answer in the morning," Samuel said, standing. Kane narrowed his eyes. "You won't get a better deal, Ellis." Samuel smiled without humor. "I won't need one." Samuel didn't speak a word as they left the bank, and Claire didn't press, but she could see it in his shoulders, rigid with purpose, not defeat. Whatever had just happened behind those frosted glass doors wasn't good, but it wasn't over. She followed his lead through the cobbled streets of Ashford until they reached the edge of town, where a modest barber shop sat with its shutters drawn and a sign that read "Closed." Samuel knocked 3 times on the back door. It opened slowly, revealing a tall man with deep brown skin, salt and pepper hair, and a sharpness in his eyes that made you straighten your back even if you hadn't done anything wrong. "Took you long enough," he said with a smirk. "You brought her?" Samuel nodded. "Claire, this is Leonard Jacobs, my father's oldest friend, and our lawyer." "Lawyer?" Claire blinked. She hadn't seen that coming. Leonard gestured them inside. "Harvard Law, class of '72. Not that it matters much in Ashford. I sweep hair and give shaves now, but I know how to read a deed and file a motion when I need to. And right now we need to." He led them into the back room, a space filled with old case books and a worn drafting table cluttered with documents. Samuel pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to Leonard. She found the letter. Leonard unfolded it slowly, scanning the words, then looked at Claire. "And you came anyway?" "I didn't have much left to lose," Claire said, her voice steady. "But I also thought maybe there was something here worth saving." Leonard smiled faintly. "You've got guts. Good. You'll need 'em." Over the next hour, the pieces fell into place. Samuel had been planning a way out for months. He'd researched every local ordinance, every state law, every federal loophole. What he found was an obscure protection clause buried in Kentucky's updated homesteading statutes, one that legally shielded property transfers between married couples from forced sales under certain conditions. But for the clause to apply, the marriage had to be registered before sunrise the day the bank claimed foreclosure. It was a thin thread, but it was strong enough if they moved fast. "Marry me," Samuel said suddenly. Claire's breath caught. Is this still part of the plan? Yes, he said, but it doesn't mean it's not real. That stopped her, because she wasn't sure what part of her life was real anymore, drifting from shelter to shelter, being watched with suspicion, enduring men who saw her as a transaction. Samuel was different. He didn't touch her without permission. Didn't ask for her pain, but made space for it anyway. Still, this wasn't a fairy tale, this was survival. And yet, maybe it was both. I'll do it, she said, quietly but clearly. Leonard wasted no time. Reverend Walker is awake. I already warned him this might happen. He's got the license ready. You've got until 5:12 IMLM. They left the barber shop under a sky full of stars. The cold wrapped around them like a final test, biting at their fingers, daring them to turn back, but neither of them did. At the little wooden church at the edge of town, Reverend Walker stood waiting in his robe, his eyes weary but kind. The ceremony was short, no music, no vows rehearsed, just a Bible passage, a signature, and the presence of Rosie, asleep in Claire's arms, like a witness the world couldn't ignore. When Reverend Walker pronounced them husband and wife, it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning of something neither of them had planned, but both of them desperately needed. By 5:08 a.m., the papers were signed. By 5:15, Samuel and Claire Ellis were walking back through town, hand in hand, with the proof of their union folded in Leonard's briefcase. They reached the bank just after sunrise. The security guard looked confused but let them in when Samuel insisted it was urgent. Thomas Kane was already there, reviewing final paperwork for the land transfer to Judge Mays. His face lit up with smug confidence, until he saw Claire at Samuel's side and the envelope in Leonard's hand. "What's this?" Kane asked. "My wife," Samuel said evenly, "and our official marriage certificate." Kane's jaw tensed. "That's not. It's legal, it's time-stamped, and it means the property falls under federal spousal protection. You can't touch it without both of our signatures." Kane looked at Leonard, who placed another document on the table. "This is also a formal complaint to the Federal Housing Commission regarding discriminatory lending practices. We've gathered comparisons of interest rates offered to black versus white landowners, along with signed statements from other farmers in the region. You'll want your legal team to review it, if you have one." The room turned ice cold. Kane sat back, swallowing hard. "You can't prove intent." "Don't have to," Leonard said. "The numbers tell the story." Before Kane could respond, the bank doors swung open. Judge Mays strode in, flanked by two associates. "What the hell is going on?" he barked. Samuel turned, calm as ever. "Resolving my mortgage?" "Kane and I had a deal," Mays said, voice low with fury. "That deal's void," Leonard replied, "because Samuel isn't in default anymore." Kane gestured to the documents. "They got married this morning." Mays stared at them like he was staring down the end of a shotgun barrel. "This is fraud. This is manipulation." "No," Claire said, stepping forward. "This is what happens when people stop letting fear make their decisions for them." Mays sneered. "You're nothing, just a drifter with a new last name." Leonard chuckled. "Careful, Your Honor. Insults don't play well when you're under federal investigation. Speaking of which..." He handed Mays a manila envelope. Inside were handwritten notes, evaluations of property made by Mays himself, ranking owners based on race, religion, and political affiliation. Proof that the judge had been stacking the deck for years. Mays turned pale. "Recognize it?" Leonard asked. "Came from your old housekeeper. The one you fired without severance." Mays looked ready to explode. "You done, Ellis?" Samuel took Claire's hand. "No, I'm free." They walked out together as the sun lit the horizon with soft gold. Rosie reached up and took both their hands. Behind them, a power structure cracked. Ahead of them, a new legacy began. By the end of that week, the story of Samuel and Claire Ellis had rippled across Ashford like a thunderclap in a dry field. First came the hushed whispers, the ones that darted from porch to market to church pew, about the sham marriage that stopped the judge's land grab, about the mysterious white woman who showed up and upended everything. But then came the headlines, Local papers picked up the story after the federal housing complaint was confirmed to be under investigation. Within a month, the State Ethics Board had opened a formal probe into Judge May's financial ties to land foreclosures and rail development in the region. The man who once ruled Ashford's courthouse like a feudal lord was now scrambling to hire lawyers to defend his name. Meanwhile, Claire and Samuel were quietly building something far more permanent than revenge. With the threat to their land now neutralized and the mortgage fully paid off, thanks in no small part to the emergency funds Claire had secretly kept from a settlement with a former employer, the Ellis homestead began to transform. What had been a symbol of survival turned into a beacon of opportunity. Samuel cleared out the old barn and converted it into a co-op workshop, where neighboring farmers, black and white, could trade, repair, and store goods collectively. The land expanded by 15 acres, bought at auction from properties the bank had previously seized and was now forced to sell fairly under scrutiny. But the most meaningful change came one quiet spring morning when Claire approached Samuel on the porch with a folded letter in hand. "It's from the State Education Fund," she said, trying to suppress her smile. "They approved the grant. We can build the school." Samuel read the letter once. Then again. He didn't speak, but the way he pulled her into his arms said everything. The Clara and Miriam Community School broke ground 2 months later, named after both the woman who built the dream and the one who had once carried it alone. It started small, 2 rooms and a modest bell tower, but it drew teachers from across the state, including one few ever expected to see back in Ashford, Eleanor Mays, the disgraced judge's widow. She arrived in a plain carriage, no attendants, her hat modest, her eyes weary. At first, the community resisted, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She scrubbed floors, she organized lesson plans, she apologized, quietly, without excuses, to every person her husband had harmed. And slowly, over time, the town stopped seeing her as the wife of a fallen tyrant and started seeing her as a woman trying to change. Claire never said she forgave Eleanor. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder. "We don't hire people based on pity," she said once when asked. "We hire based on what they're willing to rebuild." Meanwhile, Samuel continued his quiet leadership behind the scenes. He mentored young farmers on navigating land laws, working with Leonard, now officially licensed after a federal civil rights lawsuit forced the state bar to reinstate his credentials. Leonard opened the first black-owned legal practice in Ashford, setting up his office inside the same bank that had once tried to take Samuel's land. As the months passed, something else took root: trust. Children of both races sat side by side in the classroom. Town meetings stopped being segregated in practice, and when a new mayor was elected, a black woman named Delilah Grant, it was Claire and Samuel who introduced her to the community with proud applause. Yet perhaps the most personal milestone came on an overcast afternoon when Samuel found Claire kneeling in the garden, her hand resting on her belly, dirt smudging the edge of her dress. "Are you all right?" he asked, dropping beside her. She smiled and placed his hand over hers. "We're not done building." His throat tightened, not with fear, but with something deeper, something like awe. This child they hadn't planned was arriving into a world they'd fought like hell to change. And maybe it wasn't perfect, prejudice didn't vanish overnight, but for the first time Samuel believed his son or daughter might grow up not just surviving, but thriving. The townspeople who once gave him side eyes now nodded respectfully in the street, and those who still whispered kept it quiet, knowing the Ellis name was no longer one to be trifled with. It carried weight, not because of wealth or lineage, but because of something harder to earn: principle. On the anniversary of their courthouse showdown, the co-op hosted a community dinner. Long wooden tables stretched from the barn to the garden, where dozens of families gathered under string lights and blooming cherry trees. Claire gave a short speech before dinner. "We didn't set out to change Ashford," she began. "We just refused to be erased from it. We stood our ground. We spoke our truth. And in doing so, we found each other. Not just Samuel and me, but all of us." Later that evening, after the pie was served and the children danced barefoot in the grass, Samuel sat back in a rocking chair, watching the stars come out. Claire leaned against his shoulder, her fingers laced with his. Rosie, now 5, ran past them with a ribbon in her hair, and a laugh that sounded like home. Samuel exhaled slowly. I still think about that letter sometimes. The one you never sent, Claire asked. He nodded. It was never supposed to reach anyone, just something I wrote to keep from giving up. She turned to him. Maybe the universe had other plans. They didn't need to say it, but they both knew. That night in the barn, the wind howling, the flashlight shaking, the dog barking like he already knew her name, that wasn't just chance. It was two broken people finding the strength to build something unbreakable. And what they built, land, law, love, stood as proof that no matter how small you feel in the face of injustice, you are never powerless. Justice didn't always arrive wrapped in courts and verdicts. Sometimes it showed up wearing an old borrowed coat, asking for warmth and offering something greater in return, a future. If this story of quiet defiance and earned redemption moved you, subscribe to the channel for more real-life narratives, where courage doesn't always roar, but always changes the world.